In today's episode, we examine the Everest Death Zone incident, where 40 climbers kept moving past a man who was still alive. Days earlier, he'd rejected oxygen, Sherpa support, and any way to call for help, convinced he didn't need them. That stupid, ego-driven decision would put him in a position no one on the mountain was prepared for. It was May 15th, 2006, high on Mount Everest's northeast ridge, where the climb entered its most unforgiving stretch. At 27,890 feet, Green Boots Cave sat directly on the route, an exposed limestone alcove in the death zone, where oxygen levels drop below what the human body can sustain, and even standing still accelerates failure. That morning, temperatures hovered between -35 and -45 degrees Fahrenheit, with steady 25 miles per hour winds driving lethal wind chill, turning the slope into a place where stopping for minutes, not hours, could cost another life. One climber pursuing his Everest climb was David James Sharp, a 34-year-old engineer from Gisborough, Yorkshire, known for a precise, analytical mindset. With a mathematics background and a career in telecommunications, he treated climbing as a problem to be solved through research, planning, and systems rather than instinct. Months before the expedition, he immersed himself in route studies, weather data, and equipment limits, believing careful preparation could manage even Everest's most extreme risks. Sharp's final expedition did not come from inexperience. Before Everest, he had completed 2 successful ascents of Cho Oyu in 2003 and 2005, reaching above 8,000 meters and proving his ability to function at extreme altitude. Cho Oyu became his proving ground, where he tested how his body responded to thin air and refined a minimalist system built around self-reliance rather than heavy support. Friends and former partners described him as technically capable and intensely prepared, though consistently wary of the large-scale logistics that defined modern Everest expeditions. His first Everest attempt came in 2003 with a British-led team that included Richard Dugan and Jamie McGuinness. While only part of the group reached the summit, the expedition suffered no fatalities, and Dugan later noted that Sharp acclimatized well and was among the strongest climbers on the team. When frostbite began to develop near the upper mountain, the group turned back together. During the descent, Sharp assisted a struggling Spanish climber, sharing oxygen before ultimately losing several toes to frostbite himself. In 2004, Sharp returned to Everest's north side with a Franco-Austrian team led by Hugues Dobarade. He climbed to roughly 8,500 meters, but stopped short of the summit after falling behind the lead group. That expedition highlighted a growing philosophical divide. Sharp opposed the use of supplemental oxygen and objected to heavily supported climbs, a position he expressed openly in emails and discussions. Although he temporarily accepted oxygen as part of the group, the disagreement lingered. He also suffered additional frostbite to his fingers during the attempt. These earlier expeditions shaped the climb that would later define his legacy. Sharp returned in 2006 committed to a solo, oxygen-free ascent, drawing on years of high-altitude experience, repeated exposure above 8,000 meters, and a belief that preparation and restraint could replace support. What those earlier climbs could not prepare him for was how quickly isolation, timing, and the death zone's limits would converge, leaving no margin when his body finally failed high above Green Boots Cave. Sharp followed an alpine-style climbing philosophy, moving upward with minimal gear, no supplemental oxygen, and no support team to fall back on. Every decision, pace, rest, descent, was his alone, with no margin built in for failure. Even after earlier expeditions cost him several toes and fingertips to frostbite, he doubled down on that approach, returning to the mountain already physically diminished, and knowingly removing the last safety net most climbers rely on. By choosing purity over redundancy, he accepted a version of Everest where mistakes are not corrected. They are absorbed by the body until it gives out. That decision became lethal in Mount Everest's death zone, which begins around 26,000 feet. At that height, atmospheric pressure drops to roughly 1/3 of sea level, and the body starts failing by design. Blood oxygen levels plunge, the heart races even at rest, and the brain loses the ability to judge risk or recognize collapse in real time. Each step higher creates a physiological debt the body can't repay, one that quietly erases strength, clarity, and the ability to save yourself long before you realize anything is wrong. As that debt accumulates, judgment and coordination deteriorate, exposure injuries accelerate, and altitude illnesses like cerebral and pulmonary edema become more likely, with blood diverted from the extremities to preserve vital organs. Frostbite can set in rapidly, while cold wind and oxygen loss combine to make rescue increasingly dangerous. Above 26,000 feet, even stable conditions can collapse without warning, turning minutes into the difference between survival and another life lost. That morning, Sharp traveled to Kathmandu to finalize preparations for his third Everest attempt. During this visit, he met with Jamie McGuinness, an experienced expedition leader who had successfully guided multiple Everest expeditions and maintained detailed knowledge of current mountain conditions. McGuinness offered Sharp a place on a fully supported climb for approximately the same cost as Sharp's independent expedition, recognizing that Sharp's experience level warranted better support systems than his solo approach provided. The offer included comprehensive logistical support, including Sherpa assistance, fixed rope systems, supplemental oxygen, weather monitoring, communication equipment, and emergency backup protocols developed through years of expedition management. However, Sharp declined the offer after carefully considering the terms, stating he was unwilling to accept what he viewed as constraints on his climbing style. His rejection centered on philosophical differences about mountaineering approaches rather than financial considerations or personality conflicts with McGuinness or his team. McGuinness later reflected that Sharp's refusal concerned him professionally, as he recognized the additional risks inherent in solo climbing at extreme altitude, particularly for climbers attempting routes without supplemental oxygen. The conversation highlighted fundamental disagreements within the mountaineering community about acceptable risk levels and the role of support systems in high-altitude climbing, but choosing independence meant accepting its consequences. Sharp proceeded with his independent expedition plan, booking permits through a Chinese mountaineering agency and arranging minimal logistical support for transportation to base camp and basic equipment resupply. He arrived at Everest Base Camp on the Tibetan side in early May 2006, establishing his expedition headquarters among dozens of other climbing teams preparing for summit attempts during the traditional spring climbing season. The 2006 climbing season was more hostile than average, with repeated storms compressing summit attempts into brief weather windows lasting just 24 to 48 hours. At base camp, set at 17,056 feet on the Rongbuk Glacier, climbers made their final preparations, relying on forecasts and limited supplies before committing to the upper mountain. Forecasts suggested a short, high-pressure window beginning May 14th, offering reduced winds and clearer skies, but for an independent climber with minimal support, those conditions also meant a narrow margin for delay or recovery. Sharp set his climb along the standard Mount Everest Northeast Ridge from the Tibetan side, a route favored by independent climbers for its fixed infrastructure and relatively predictable conditions compared to the south side. From the plateau of Tibet, the route moved upward in clear stages. Advanced Base Camp at 21,300 feet served as the final logistical hub, while the climb to North Col at 23,000 feet marked the first true barrier, where wind exposure and sustained cold began to dominate movement. Above that, Camp 2 at 24,500 feet functioned as a staging area for higher rotations, and Camp 3 at 27,390 feet sat just below the death zone's most punishing terrain, where oxygen levels dropped sharply and recovery became increasingly limited. Each of these camps played a specific role in the climb. Supplies were cached, equipment was adjusted, and time was deliberately spent allowing the body to adapt before moving higher. Progress above one camp was never intended to be permanent at first. Climbers climbed high, then descended, repeating the cycle to force physiological adaptation, while minimizing the risk of sudden altitude collapse. Sharp moved through this system in early May, following established acclimatization practices. He limited increases in sleeping altitude to roughly 1,000 feet per day above 10,000 feet and incorporated rest days at key elevations, particularly after reaching North Col and Camp 2. Medical observations during this period showed expected adaptation responses, including increased red blood cell production and improved oxygen efficiency. By the time he positioned himself for a summit attempt, there were no signs that his acclimatization was failing, only that he was operating at the outer edge of what the human body can tolerate without support. On May 14th, Sharp began his final ascent from Camp 3 toward Everest's 29,032-foot summit. Climbing conditions that morning appeared favorable, with wind speeds below 20 miles per hour and temperatures around -25 degrees Fahrenheit, within acceptable parameters for summit attempts. Sharp's climbing pace without supplemental oxygen significantly slowed his progress compared to teams using bottled oxygen systems, as his body had to function on approximately one-third the oxygen availability of sea level conditions. His route from Camp 3 followed fixed ropes installed by earlier expedition teams, providing safety anchors and route-finding assistance through the most technical sections. Evidence from other climbing teams suggests Sharp reached the summit around 4 p.m. on May 14th, several hours later than the generally accepted safe return time of 2 p.m. for climbers operating without supplemental oxygen. McGuinness later stated that reaching the summit at 4 p.m. without oxygen might as well be equivalent to summiting in the middle of the night on the moon, emphasizing how dangerous late-day summit times become at extreme altitude. The late summit timing meant Sharp faced descent through the most technical and dangerous sections of the route in darkness and deteriorating weather conditions, when hypothermia risk increased dramatically and navigation became significantly more challenging. During his descent, Sharp moved into rapidly worsening conditions. After sunset, temperatures dropped to between -30 and -40 degrees Fahrenheit, while rising winds stripped heat from exposed skin and accelerated loss of core body temperature. The physical cost of the summit effort, combined with oxygen deprivation and cold, slowed his movement and degraded coordination. At extreme altitude, these factors also reduce the body's ability to generate heat, turning pauses into compounding setbacks rather than moments of recovery. Sometime late that night, likely between 11 p.m. and midnight, Sharp left the fixed descent line and entered Green Boots Cave, a shallow limestone alcove at 27,890 feet. The cave already contained the preserved remains of Sewang Paljor, who had died there a decade earlier. The location was well known to climbers on the northeast ridge, not as a shelter, but as a waypoint marking proximity to the summit and the beginning of the most dangerous stretch of descent. Green Boots Cave offered limited protection from direct wind, but little else. The alcove measured roughly 8 feet wide and 4 feet deep, with a low ceiling that forced anyone inside to crouch or sit. That position restricted circulation, reduced heat generation, and made it increasingly difficult to stand or move once cold set in. With no insulation beyond clothing and no active heat source, body temperature continued to drop even while inside the shelter. Entering the cave marked a critical turning point. While it reduced immediate wind exposure, it also halted continuous descent, the only action that could have slowed hypothermia and oxygen loss. At 27,890 feet, every hour spent stationary further drained strength and coordination. As body temperature fell and muscle function declined, the ability to leave the cave and rejoin the route narrowed rapidly, turning a pause into effective entrapment at an altitude where recovery was no longer possible. That isolation was compounded by the fact that Sharp was climbing outside any formal expedition structure. He had not registered a summit push, carried no radio or satellite phone, and had not told anyone when he planned to go for the top. Although other climbers saw him ascending earlier, there was no system tracking his location. At the same time, attention on the mountain was divided when 2 less experienced climbers from the same loose group went missing elsewhere on the route and were later found alive but suffering from frostbite. Because of this, Sharp's absence did not immediately raise concern. Climbers who had traveled with him, including George D. Marescu, only realized something was wrong when he failed to return later that night on May 15th, and no one could confirm seeing him descend. Even then, the delay seemed plausible. Sharp had previously turned back when conditions worsened, and it was assumed he had sheltered at a higher camp or bivouacked on the route, an extreme but sometimes used option at that altitude. It was not until the following morning that Sharp's condition became clear. Around 7 a.m., a Turkish team of 3 experienced climbers ascending toward the summit encountered him inside Green Boots Cave. They found him conscious but severely impaired, disoriented, slurring his words, and unable to coordinate basic movements. According to their accounts, Sharp raised a hand to acknowledge them and gestured for the team to continue upward rather than stop. While he was responsive enough to signal basic intent, his condition reflected advanced hypothermia and altitude sickness, limiting his ability to accurately assess the danger he was in. By the time word began spreading through the route that a climber was incapacitated in the cave, Sharp had already spent the night at 27,890 feet. With no communication, no support team, and no way to initiate a coordinated response, the window for effective intervention had already narrowed to almost nothing. The Turkish team faced a critical decision common in death zone encounters: attempt a rescue that would likely fail while risking their own lives and those of their Sherpa support team, or continue their climb and hope other teams with better resources might help Sharp later. Team leader Serhan Pokan later described the impossible nature of the choice, explaining that rescue attempts at that altitude required specific equipment, additional manpower, and weather conditions that were not available that morning. The team made the difficult decision to continue their ascent while notifying other climbers by radio about Sharp's location and condition. As the morning progressed, multiple other climbing teams discovered Sharp in increasingly deteriorated condition. Dawa Sherpa, a high-altitude worker with extensive rescue experience and superior altitude tolerance, spent approximately 30 minutes attempting to get Sharp to stand and begin descending under his own power. Sherpa's rescue technique involved providing physical support while encouraging Sharp to activate his remaining muscle function, but Sharp could not maintain balance or coordinate the complex movements necessary for safe descent on steep terrain. Despite the Sherpa's attempts to assist, Sharp was unable to stand, bear weight, or perform the basic movements required to clip into fixed lines or climb independently. Observers noted minimal leg response and severely impaired upper body coordination, consistent with advanced hypothermia, extreme altitude exposure, and exhaustion. With no capacity for self-movement and no equipment or manpower available to lower or stabilize him at that elevation, the Sherpa withdrew from the location and continued the descent. Around 9:30 a.m., another climber reached the cave. Maxim Chaya, a Lebanese climber with medical training and experience treating the altitude illness. Chaya remained with Sharp for close to an hour, attempting more extensive aid and assessing his condition using observable signs rather than equipment. Based on Sharp's confusion, slurred and largely unintelligible speech, and complete loss of leg function, Chaya identified advanced hypothermia, likely with a core temperature below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and determined that Sharp lacked the coordination or strength required to descend. Chaya described Sharp's condition in plain clinical terms. Frostbite had turned parts of his hands and forearms black, a sign that the tissue was already dead after prolonged exposure to extreme cold and poor circulation. His eyes were open and occasionally followed movement, but his replies were slow, confused, and often didn't match the questions, clear signs that lack of oxygen and severe cold were affecting his brain. Based on those signs, Chaya concluded that Sharp's hypothermia had progressed beyond what could be. Recovery would have required immediate descent to lower altitude and active warming, resources that simply didn't exist at that height. With no ability to move, no way to generate body heat, and extensive frostbite already present, any attempt to evacuate him would likely have caused cardiac arrest or another fatal collapse before reaching safety. As the situation unfolded, Russell Bryce, an expedition leader coordinating several teams by radio, began receiving steady, overlapping reports from climbers moving through the area. The details did not change. Sharp was alive but unable to stand, unable to clip into fixed lines, and incapable of assisting in his own descent. From experience, Bryce understood what that meant in practical terms. At nearly 28,000 feet, a rescue would require several climbers to stop for extended periods in the death zone, abandon their summit bids, and attempt to move a fully incapacitated adult without supplemental oxygen, shelter, or any hauling system. In those conditions, the odds were not just poor. They were lethal for everyone involved. His assessment was blunt. Continued rescue attempts would not change the outcome and would likely add more deaths to the mountain. Radio traffic throughout the morning confirmed the scale of the dilemma. Climbers described trying to speak with Sharp, reposition him, and determine whether he could move even a few steps. Each report ended the same way: no leg function, delayed or incoherent responses, and visible deterioration as time passed. Weather updates from base camp warned that winds would increase later in the day, tightening an already narrow window for safe descent. In the death zone, even brief stops accelerate physical collapse. Techniques that might work lower on the mountain, rewarming, carrying, or lowering a climber, were impossible without equipment and rested manpower that simply did not exist on the route that day. This is why so many climbers continued past him. Over the course of the day, an estimated 40 climbers passed through Green Boots Cave, some on the way up, others trying to get down. Many assumed Sharp was already dead, based on his condition and lack of response. Others were told that help had been attempted and failed. Several were themselves close to exhaustion, low on oxygen, or racing against daylight to avoid becoming stranded higher on the mountain. At that altitude, stopping does not create safety. It often guarantees another emergency. Sharp spent his final hours alone inside the cave as climbers continued to funnel through the narrow passage above him. Severe hypothermia, altitude sickness, and exhaustion had rendered him completely immobile in the death zone, an environment where the body cannot stabilize, recover, or reverse decline without rapid descent. With no ability to move or generate heat, his condition continued to deteriorate as the day passed and temperatures dropped. Several days later, descending climbers encountered him in the same seated position, now unresponsive and clearly deceased. He remained beside the earlier remains of Tsewang Paljor, reinforcing the cave's role not as shelter, but as a fixed reference point on the route, one that climbers passed rather than stopped at. Due to altitude, weather, and risk to other climbers, no recovery attempt was made, and Sharp's body was left where he died. In the weeks that followed, expedition leaders, journalists, and mountaineering organizations reconstructed his final timeline using radio logs, witness accounts, weather data, and camp departure records. The analysis confirmed that once Sharp lost the ability to descend under his own power, survival was no longer realistic. His death became one of the most closely examined fatalities on Everest, frequently cited in discussions about rescue limits, summit pressure, and the ethics of high-altitude climbing. Over time, Sharp's body became part of the mountain's grim geography, occasionally referenced by climbers navigating the northeast ridge. His death did not result in a single clear verdict of blame, but it permanently altered how Everest deaths were discussed, shifting the focus from moral judgment to the hard limits of human capability at extreme altitude, where passing by can be the difference between one death and many. Sharp's death sparked intense debate within the mountaineering community over what climbers owe each other at extreme altitude. Critics argued that greater risks should have been taken to attempt a rescue, while others pointed out that in the death zone, failed rescues often create more fatalities without changing the outcome. Expedition leaders largely supported the decisions made on scene, stressing that rescue must be guided by realistic chances of success, not moral impulse alone. The tragedy exposed a deeper divide between individual responsibility and collective aid on Everest. It prompted renewed scrutiny of rescue protocols and equipment, but later, reviews reached the same conclusion. Given Sharp's condition and the limits of the death zone, no available intervention could have changed the result. Sharp's death led to lasting changes in how Everest expeditions are planned and managed. Commercial teams tightened turnaround times, strengthened client screening, and expanded emergency equipment and communication standards to reduce death zone risks. The incident also intensified debate over Everest's commercialization, highlighting the tension between traditional, self-reliant climbing styles and modern safety systems designed to limit exposure. His family publicly acknowledged his choices and urged that blame not be placed on other climbers facing impossible decisions at extreme altitude, a statement that eased some controversy even as debate continued. Today, his body remains in Green Boots Cave, a stark reminder that on Everest, preparation and ambition are always secondary to the mountain's limits. Thank you for watching. If this episode gave you a clearer view of how Everest pushes climbers past the limits of rescue, consider subscribing for more real-world breakdowns. Share your thoughts below. We read every comment.